have a lot to talk about, so we're going to just dive right in. We called this event at some point "What Happened When Trump Met Xi," but we're actually going to talk about the entire 12-day trip to Asia that President Trump just came back from, and we'll sort of put the China piece, you know, as Chinese officials like to say, at the core. But we're going to talk about the whole trip. And I don't know, many of you may have seen this, but this afternoon, President Trump gave his own assessment of the trip in pretty lengthy and remarkably cogent, scripted remarks. And we'll have a chance to talk about your thoughts on his framing of what took place and how you view what occurred on the trip and what it augurs for U.S. policy, the U.S.-China relationship, and the dynamics of the Asia-Pacific, or whatever we're calling it now, region. But I wanted to start just to try to establish a little bit of a baseline so that we can think about what made this trip different from previous presidential trips to Asia and kind of where those differences come from. So I want to start by asking Danny, who spent decades working in Asia for the State Department and during the Obama administration served not only as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, but also as the Senior Director for East Asia on the National Security Council in the White House, and hence was deeply involved in the strategy, planning, and orchestration of past presidential visits to Asia, I'm sure stretching back quite a long way. So I want Danny to set the scene a little bit and just sort of sketch out for us when past presidents have traveled to Asia, what does the process look like? How much happens ahead of the trip versus on it or after it? What are the negotiations like? How do you think about the mix of ceremony and substance, strategic communications, protocol, and maybe most importantly, sort of what's the utility of a trip like this? It's an exhausting, complicated expedition. It wears everybody involved out. You know, what is a trip like this good for when it's working at its best?
Well, it's a tall order, Susie, but I'll try. I've been on the receiving end of presidential visits to the countries in whose embassies I've served overseas, and I've also been involved in the planning and the execution, certainly of all of the Asia trips of President Obama, Vice President Biden, and to a lesser order of magnitude, the travel of national security advisors and secretaries of state. Look, it's grueling to be on the trip. It's even tougher to prepare for it. But there are different benchmarks that you can use to evaluate the relative success or failure of any trip. Obviously, if something dramatically goes wrong, that's a huge problem, and a not inconsiderable amount of effort goes into ensuring that the logistics and the protocol, the press arrangements, et cetera, are as organized and as smooth as you can make them so that the trip looks good. But the real issue is substantive, because there's no more precious commodity in the world than the time of the President of the United States. And just to get to Asia eats up a considerable amount of time. The arrival ceremonies, the pomp and circumstance, the honor guards, the banquets, all that eats up a lot of time. So the question number one is, what can the president get done that matters and that can't be done by somebody else? Because the easy stuff should and will generally be taken care of by the ambassador to the country, by the Secretary of State, by diplomats. So what are those things? I think the second question is, how do you maximize the leverage that comes with a state visit or a summit? Because this is, in a way, the world's biggest crowbar. The President of the United States visiting a capital like Beijing is the leverage that can move some of these intractable issues. But to move them, to use that leverage, takes a very substantial amount of preparation. I'd say the third index is, what impact does it have, not just on the issue, not just on the host country, but on the region as a whole and on attitudes towards the United States, specifically in terms of our influence and our credibility. So to prepare for a trip, absolutely the most important thing is for the U.S. side, for the government, to get its act together, because there are a lot of agencies with a big agenda. The relationship with China is a huge and important one that has many, many different dimensions. And if you get all the horses pulling in opposite directions, you're not going to win the Ben-Hur race. So corralling the interests, ensuring that the president is presented with real goals, with real priorities, with a real strategy, starting a process early so that, in this case, the Chinese hear the same message across the board consistently. This is what's important. This is what we need. This is what success looks like. Being able to leverage the tremendous importance that the Chinese put on form, substance, protocol, image, and use that as barter material to try to get some of the substantive outcomes that are important to us. That's really, I think, the hallmark of a well-prepared and a successful visit. And then lastly, the question is, do the countries around China, do the allies, partners, and fence-sitters in East Asia, in South Asia, in the world, come away after the visit believing that the United States has a good approach, a plan for dealing with China that's neither to recreate a Cold War nor to naively succumb to the Chinese agenda? Have we reinforced our credibility as well as have we engineered meaningful outcomes on issues that we truly care about in the U.S.-China relationship?
So, Bonnie, I'll let you, Danny, you'll have a chance to say how this particular trip fit or did not fit with that sort of prototype. But let me let Bonnie, who has also been deeply involved in U.S. policy on Asia for many years and who interacts regularly with U.S. diplomats, Asian diplomats. Maybe you can, Bonnie, just sort of give us your quick and general assessment of how well this trip accomplished some of the things that Danny just described. How does it look held up against that template?
Well, let me start by saying that the administration put out very explicit goals that they wanted to achieve for this visit, and they sent them out to the press and to the think tank community. So from where I sit, I'm somebody who receives the advance briefing that people like Danny used to give, then one thing that actually this administration, I think, did quite well was during the trip. At several of the stops, made phone calls to a few dozen people to talk about each individual stop and what they were doing. But they really messaged early on that they wanted to achieve three goals, they said explicitly, and I think there was a fourth that was maybe implicit. And those three goals very quickly were to mobilize the international community to put more pressure on North Korea, to put forward a vision of a U.S. strategy toward the region that they have decided to call the Indo-Pacific, and then to promote fair and reciprocal trade and economic relations in the region. The implicit goal, I think, was to reassure the region, which has been, I think, very concerned about the Trump administration having walked away from TPP, having occasionally tweeted things about Kim Jong-un, little rocket man, and made people, I think, nervous about whether we might wake up one morning and see that the U.S. has actually launched an attack. So what was interesting to me was the parts of the trip that seemed very well scripted. When the president would read the teleprompter, I would just cite one example, the speech that he gave in Korea, which I thought had some very good elements to it, making sure that the Koreans knew that the U.S. has not completely walked away from diplomacy, talking about the North Koreans themselves, and which many Koreans I talked to have said that it's very rarely discussed, the plight of the North Koreans in a public way like that. So I mean, there were moments. I think on the trade front, that the president at the APEC meeting did his best, which was simply to read a speech, and I think along the way to put forward this message that the United States wants to have free trade agreements with countries in the region and the 11 members now of the TPP. But I think the problem is that except for those few countries that have free trade agreements with the U.S., they don't seem very eager to negotiate them. And so I think that there wasn't a very successful job of putting out a new economic policy. And in everything that I have read, I still don't see really the vision of the Indo-Pacific. Just some, snippets or headlines, but I don't see a hell of a lot. So I think there was a lot of work that went into preparing the trip. There were speeches that were written, but of course, ultimately, when the president sits down with leaders, he has to have in his mind what he wants to achieve with each individual leader. And we can take the example that Danny raised of China, enormous amount of pomp and circumstance in that trip. And if you look at the concrete things that the United States got from it, at least so far from what we have seen, I don't think we see very much.
So I want to come back to trade in a minute, but and back to China. But I want to give Orville a chance. No, that's okay. This is how it's going to work. I want to give. So Orville was actually on the trip with Donald Trump. He's on an assignment for a forthcoming story for Vanity Fair, and he was on the trip for the Japan, Korea, and China portion. So I thought maybe, Orville, you could just talk a little bit about the first two countries and what you saw there as somebody sort of on the ground, how you thought the president comported himself.
Well, I think Japan and Korea actually it was quite encouraging in a way. He, as Bonnie pointed out, he did give good speeches, and he did read the teleprompter, and he didn't do a lot of miscellaneous chatter. He wasn't blaming, explaining, or doing any kind of marginalia, and I think it went pretty well. I think he was very impressed by the pomp and ceremony. There was a lot of it. You're right, Danny. And I think Donald Trump certainly does appreciate a high level of pomp and ceremony. And I mean, all you have to do is wander through one Trump hotel and you can see that. So I think everybody was quite surprised by how orderly it was and by how, it seemed like the staff had captured his attention. And we were sitting in the National Assembly in Seoul, and he was giving this very good speech. I think, Bonnie, you were just mentioning it on North Korea. And I saw this friend of all of ours who's the National Security Advisor for Asia sitting down there in the front row. So I emailed him, and I said, hey, your guy's giving a pretty good speech. And he emailed back to say, not bad, he said, if I dare say so myself. And of course, he'd written it. And we were all a little bit inspired to think that the trip would go sort of like that. And what was happening? Well, he was reassuring Japan. He was reassuring Korea that we were good allies after having told them they're going to have to pay for more of their own defense and being very uncertain about, as he was with NATO. And he had a very good relationship with Abe. I'd say of all of the people that he buddied up with, the leaders, Abe was probably the best job that he did. They seem to actually have a little chemistry, a big thing for Donald Trump, this idea of chemistry. You know, they had the little...
Abe got him the hat.
They got a little hat exchange. You all heard that. Was it we're making the alliance...
Shinzo and Donald.
Shinzo and Donald making the alliance great again. Okay, it was Shinzo Abe's gift to Donald. He could appreciate that. So that was good, and we flew off to Beijing, and then, of course, Beijing is sort of the big enchilada. This is where the cement is really going to be mixed. This is where things really start to matter. And this is a country that isn't an ally. This is a country that isn't a democracy. It doesn't have an open press. And so the whole wager suddenly became very, very differently. One other thing I will say to you, on those first two countries, I had this distinct impression, and Danny, you and I were talking about this earlier, when he gives a speech, you almost think he's reading away, and he's saying, "Boy," he's saying, "This is interesting. You know, I'm actually learning something here." And I do think that for him, he is a experiential creature. He is not an intellectual. He is not a reader. And so when he actually gets into a discussion with the leader, he is learning things he's never heard before. And when he gives a speech, this is actually his sort of study course. And I think it's surprising to him sometimes what he's saying, because he may not have heard it before. Now, in the National Assembly, there was some discussion why he didn't come out right away, and I forget who was it got up and said that President Trump is in the back room working on his speech. I hate to think what that was like, but, you know, so the idea was that he was involving himself somewhat. But I think by and large, these things are just kind of given to him. And he goes out and he does it. And if he reads it, good. I mean, you know, and he's got good staff people, it goes pretty well. But then, of course, we come to the other part of the trip, which we can talk about.
What do you, maybe we should stay on Korea for a second. I mean, what do you make, any of you, of these sort of dizzying shifts in the administration's rhetoric on North Korea? I mean, we had Little Rocket Man, Fire and Fury. You know, shortly before he left the White House, Steve Bannon said there are no credible military options. There was this more moderate rhetoric in South Korea, and then a few days later, the president tweeted, you know, why would Kim Jong-un insult me by calling me old when I would never, in all caps, call him short and fat? Oh, well, I try so hard to be his friend. Maybe someday it will happen. And then today, you have China announced that it's sending the head of the CCP's External Affairs Department to North Korea on what seems to be a trip that may result in some urging for further talks. The president's rhetoric this afternoon was kind of more moderate, and then he also said that he and Xi Jinping had agreed when they were talking that they would not countenance a freeze of the DPRK's nuclear program like the one in the agreed framework during the Clinton administration. So, what do you make of where all this is going? How scared should we be?
Sure. Well, for all of the repudiation of the Obama era and the Obama and Bush policies on Asia and North Korea, as Orville and Bonnie have pointed out, there was a lot of conventional aspects visible in the president's trip. The fact that he began in two allied capitals, which is precisely the same thing that Obama did in 2009, is a very good thing, a very important thing. And look, if, as Orville suggests, the president is learning on the job, wouldn't we rather have him learn from democratically elected leaders like Abe Shinzo and Moon Jae-in? They're the ones who really can and should, I think, explain what the important values, principles, and policies are to maintain the kind of stability in the Asia-Pacific region that the U.S. has championed.
And do you have the sense that they got what they needed from him? Or from the U.S.?
Well, I think that the fact of the visit and the substance of what the president said while he visited went a long way to offset the anxiety and the confusion that had been spawned in the first in the transition, but then in the first 6 months or so of the administration. Whether you're dealing with your allies, Japan and Korea, or you're dealing with an adversary like North Korea, I'm sure there's a role for fake-outs and psychological warfare on the part of the Pentagon and the CIA. But when it comes to the President of the United States and the administration, I tend to suspect that consistency, demonstration of resolve, clear messaging is probably what's important. It may be that name-calling was the secret of success in the Republican primary, but this is a guy with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. He's also got a propaganda ministry and a pretty experienced name-calling team. I don't think that taunts are going to help either with the leader of North Korea, nor will they really help bolster the confidence and the faith of the allies and the partners. What does work on both counts is unity, is a sustained, credible policy of deterrence, of defense, and keeping the door open for diplomacy. And so when I look at the Trump Asia policy generally, setting aside some of the significant outliers and exceptions like the abandonment of TPP and the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and so on, I see a lot that's awfully familiar to me from the Obama years. And the notion of approaching North Korea with a two-track strategy of maximizing pressure through sanctions, galvanizing international support, and working hard on the China angle, but at the same time making it clear that there is a peaceful path through authentic negotiations, well, hey, that was the strategy that the Obama administration pursued over 8 years, and I think it's a good thing that it is continuing in that sense.
There are, of course, some important differences, and I do think that the fact that President Trump, from virtually day one, made North Korea the top agenda item in the U.S.-China relationship, and made it clear that that was almost the litmus test of the relationship, was different from what we saw under any prior president. And this is, of course, in part because of the recognition of the urgency of the North Korean threat. And of course, that evolved over the Obama administration. I think most people in the intelligence community would say that North Korea made faster progress than we had anticipated early in the Obama administration. So the message that was delivered at Mar-a-Lago, to Xi Jinping was, it's all about North Korea. Now, it's never a good idea to just have one item on your agenda, so I'm a little critical of that. But putting it at the forefront, letting Xi Jinping realize that there wasn't going to be a good U.S.-China relationship unless the Chinese got on board with the strategy of putting more pressure on North Korea. I give the Trump administration credit for that. We have seen up at the UN that the Chinese have signed on to UN Security Council resolutions that have cut off imports of seafood and iron ore and coal and textiles, all sorts of things that they had not done in the past. Again, in part because of the recognition of the urgency. And if Hillary Clinton had been elected, her policy might have been quite similar. So it's I'm not saying that this is necessarily it's not a brilliant move. It was the obvious move, but he did it, and I give him credit for that. You mentioned the trip that Song Tao, who is the head of the International Liaison Department, or International Department of the party, is going to make to North Korea. And I just want to at least give you sort of my sense of that trip, because either this is something Xi Jinping told President Trump about, and they talked about what the message would be, and he's carrying some tough message there, or this is a surprise. to the Trump administration, that after Trump departed from China, left Asia, that now Xi Jinping has decided that the China-Korea relationship, North Korea relationship, has deteriorated beyond the point that the Chinese can accept. It is really at a low point, and I think the Chinese are quite fearful of the implications of a rupture in that relationship. So I'm not prepared to say which one it is, but I wonder if the Trump administration says, right on, this is what he's doing, or they're really surprised. Usually the tough messages that are delivered by the Chinese to the North Koreans are delivered by a foreign ministry official, not a party official.
And do all of you agree that North Korea is deterrable at this point in its nuclear ambitions? And do you think the Chinese think it is? I mean, there has been some mixed signaling on that question also from the current administration.
Well, we certainly, I mean, U.S. policy is predicated on the belief that North Korea can be deterred from using nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. The empirical evidence shows that North Korea can't be deterred from pursuing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. I think I agree generally with what Bonnie said. I think the fact that Song Tao is visiting Pyongyang this week is very important. Now, it is normal for a senior party person to travel to socialist brother capitals and the aftermath of the party congress and brief. It is also the case that the foreign minister, Wang Yi, who had attempted to go to Pyongyang, was refused entry, was rejected.
So is the lower level official, Kong Xuan-yu.
And Kong Xuan-yu is the official now who is responsible for North Korea. He's their special representative. And by all rights, if the goal was to deliver a message on North Korea, he's the one who one would have thought would have gone. There was very precious little time between the conclusion of the 19th Party Congress and the visit of President Trump, so it may not surprise us that the trip to Pyongyang didn't occur before then. But having received President Trump, it's easy to imagine that Xi Jinping would direct Song Tao to convey to Kim Jong-un or to the senior-most North Korean officials that he can meet that China has done everything in its power to hold back the warmongering American imperialists who were just itching to attack, and it's thanks to Xi Jinping's intervention that there hasn't been a preemptive strike, et cetera, but that it's unclear how long we can hold this tide back, and you guys really need to make some kind of concession or accommodation. And that the other half of the message is, look, I talked to President Trump. He's not entirely unreasonable. The Americans would be open to some sort of negotiation. You can probably get more at the bargaining table than you can get through huffing and puffing and blustering and threatening. The important thing is to lower the temperature. Trump is the artist of the deal. Why don't you see if you can't make a deal? And we'll see. Chinese messages of restraint to North Korea don't have a record of particular success. But as Bonnie pointed out, this is a moment increasingly of real tension and real risk, and we'll see what happens.
I want to give Orville a chance to talk about what happened when Trump arrived finally in Beijing. He said this afternoon that he and Melania were greatly honored by the splendor of their reception. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about what that was.
Before
like.
maybe getting to Beijing, I do think Trump is absolutely right to put North Korea at the top of the list. It's a dangerous problem, and he certainly has gotten the world's attention. I think where it gets a little dangerous is he tends to really personalize everything, friend and foe. So for him, every relationship is really, it's almost like a kind of a courtship. And I think, he's obviously very alienated from Kim Jong-un and calls him all sorts of bad names and threatens him. But I think you really saw this in Japan, Korea, and China, that each of these big leaders for him is almost as if he was wooing another wife. And he talks about it that way, the chemistry, the friendship. It's really...
Xi Jinping was a very special man.
Very special man. I mean, it's almost like he's on some kind of Asian computer dating trip. And it gets very, very personal with him. And I think that in the process, it's so important to him to have a good relationship, in his view, that he's won over the other leader, that often the policy issues kind of get lost in the shuffle. And he forgets exactly why he's there, which is not simply to woo and court and win the leader, but that there is an agenda, that his country has interests that need to be discussed, need to be defended in an orderly and a sort of comprehensive way. So I think this does explain sometimes the way things kind of get lost in the mix as he goes around Asia. He's so focused on the interaction. That's his world. That's sort of the television world. That's the world of the deal. You're always talking to one guy. The big guys make the deal. The other people have to work out the details. And I think that as we got to China, I'm not quite sure what the deal finally was, the $350 billion worth of... 250.
Well, it went from 9
or maybe
to
a trillion.
250
or
maybe triple that to
whatever.
MOUs.
It's a pretty big rounding error, even
a lot
for
of MOUs.
erstwhile billionaire Commerce Secretary.
A lot of very uncertain things, and a fair share of deals that would have probably come down anyway. So what's that worth? Well, I mean, I think you have to discount it. So finally, I think you do have to ask in Beijing, what finally did he get? Well, we don't know everything that was talked about. Whether something actually may have been discussed in this trip by Sun Tao would be a result of some of the things that went on between him and Xi Jinping. But I think to say that he was infatuated, you watched him, and I was standing about 10 feet away from them as he and Xi marched by the band and the kids waving the flowers and the little flags, the very sort of boilerplate stuff. And the kids were practicing for like an hour before, and this very stern director would say, all right, now I'm going to come down the red carpet, and when I reach this point, you want all the flags and the flowers to start moving into action. You didn't see a lot of chemistry coming back from Xi Jinping. First of all, they couldn't speak to each other. And it's hard to know what was in Xi Jinping's head, except that this is a man we have to deal with. This is a man that needs to be manipulated. This is a man we need to show deference to, and we need to treat with great delicacy. And we understand what it is he really wants. He wants, he wants the same thing, actually, ironically, that China wants. He wants to be respected.
Visit plus.
Yeah,
Plus
state
plus.
visit plus.
Plus plus.
Yeah.
Plus plus.
Yeah.
Daddy and I were talking earlier about how a few weeks ago we were talking to somebody who was somewhat critical of the administration's Asia policy, and they were saying he's going to arrive in China and they're going to wave some shiny thing in front of him and he's going to, succumb. And he literally walked into the Forbidden City and there was a gold vase just sort of sitting on a table, there for him to pick up. So metaphors.
I mean, human relations in diplomacy and politics matter a lot, and personal relations among leaders is a factor in the equation. All that said, I don't think that there's much in Leninist doctrine that would lead you to believe that a leader like Xi Jinping is going to be sentimental when it comes to China's core interests and national interests. Moreover, I was a fly on the wall in all of the meetings that President Obama and Vice President Biden, Secretary Clinton and Kerry had with Xi Jinping, first as Vice President and then as president. And this is a tough-minded, patriotic, very forceful, visionary leader who is determined. He's got a plan. And so having a nice meeting and having a nice chocolate cake, having a nice dinner, enjoying the entertainment is all well and good. But I don't see any prospect for that materially altering the trajectory of China's strategy or its approach when there is a divergence between U.S. and Chinese strategic interests. And the big question apropos of North Korea is, what is the extent of the convergence and what is the extent of the divergence between what we each really want? Now, we know that both leaders have said over and over again they are committed to the complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea, and that's been China's position since the early 2000s. But at what cost? Because the Chinese leader, in my experience, has always emphasized the importance of avoiding war and avoiding chaos, the collapse of North Korea. So I think Donald Trump went to Beijing to try to get Xi Jinping to do more things to North Korea. I think Xi Jinping received Donald Trump intending to prevent him from doing more things to North Korea if those things risked either war or chaos.
So, Dave, let me ask both of you a question. That one thing that Trump did confer on Xi Jinping was a kind of a deference. What do you think that's worth in the grand scheme of things in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, in terms of getting something out? I mean, he didn't raise human rights. He didn't sort of put it to Xi the way other presidents have, on being on the wrong side of the history, or you're not democratic, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's
No questions
worth
at the press
much?
conference.
Well, I think it is worth something, but let's also recall that when there are messages from U.S. presidents that the Chinese don't like, they filter them out and they try to prevent them from getting out to the public in any case. They're not always successful, of course. But I do think that Xi Jinping had just emerged, right, from the 19th Party Congress.
And Trump
in a
had
very
praised his
strong position. And yes, Trump had tweeted that he'd been elevated, right? And Trump was and in fact the Chinese told the Americans this, that President Trump will be the first foreign leader to visit after this 19th Party Congress. So this was conveyed as a special privilege that they were bestowing upon Trump. And I think that they appreciated the fact that the Americans did not insist, for example, on questions at the press conference, that there was this agreement to spend time at the Forbidden City, which, let's remember, this is a message of the superiority of the 5,000 years of Chinese history, and Xi Jinping's message of the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation and emerging from this century of national humiliation and becoming a very strong country. And so he was, I think, treated very much like an equal, the leader of a country that has arrived. And I think that's enormous.
Is that here to
for Xi
stay?
Jinping.
I mean, was this a turning point? Are the U.S. and China now going to sort of behave more as
Trump believes, I think, that flattery gets him something. And so we don't know what it is that China will deliver. On the North Korea piece, the ask was for a cut in crude oil exports. But we will see with time. Maybe if there is another ICBM test at range, or God forbid a hydrogen test in the atmosphere, maybe we will see something like that from China. The Chinese have been debating internally intensely whether to cut oil, by how much, for how long, because they don't want to, most people don't want to do it in perpetuity. It would be for a limited period of time. On the trade front, I think, Xi Jinping just wanted to fend off tariffs and other trade remedies, just as he wanted to fend off pressure on the North Korea front. So what China really wanted out of this was just to get the United States to back away from some of its asks. But if President Trump got one thing quickly, apparently it was the ask to release the three American athletes
who had been
who were
accused of shoplifting,
and were detained by the Chinese and apparently were released at the request of the President of the United States. So I don't know whether he's already spent whatever political capital.
Which is right, which is an easier request than release the wife of Liu Xiaobo.
Yeah. So I'd just make 2 points in response to Orville's question. One is, it would be a mistake to equate deference with respect. So showing respect to foreign leader is utterly appropriate, and I think that is the sine qua non for any American president dealing with a foreign counterpart, let alone the president of China. That's a good thing. Showing deference is a different matter entirely. So first, I think, as you were implying, Bonnie, the prospect of the North Korean, the prospect of the Chinese taking a step well beyond their comfort zone and really turning the oil spigot down wouldn't come as a result of flattery. It would come as a result of further misbehavior, threatening behavior by North Korea. So I don't know that deference or the sort of bromance approach to Xi Jinping is necessarily going to net the intended outcomes from the Chinese side. But the second point is that the whole world is watching. That there is much more here than just the Chinese audience, which, as Bonnie pointed out, will only hear what the Ministry of Propaganda and the authorities allow it to hear. What the American audience hears, there's the entire region.
And so what happens when, I mean, we haven't discussed the kind of most jaw-dropping moment of the China trip, which was when Trump said that, we had this unfair trade relationship, and he didn't blame China for that. He said, I don't blame China. Who can blame a country for being able to take advantage of another country to benefit its citizens? And then he gave him credit, and I blame our problems on
and
previous
that wasn't his message in Japan. He blamed the Chinese.
How does something, I mean, that's quite an extraordinary.
He was really blaming the Obama administration, saying, in effect, that was then, and you guys took advantage of it, but now, we got a different relationship, and there are different terms of the game.
Well,
right.
I think
we can talk about how do people in the region hear that, and what do they think?
I think there are a couple of things at work here. First of all, to the extent that countries in the region hear this, who can blame China for doing what it has the power to do and getting away with it? Combining that with this very heavy emphasis on sovereignty in his speeches, including at APEC, his rejection of multilateral institutions, his we're going it alone, it's America first. There's a kind of Hobbesian, dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest undertone to that message. That is definitely not what smaller countries who are swimming in China's orbit want to hear from the world superpower who's been, over the decades, the guarantor of the system of rules that has protected them. Secondly, if there is a perception, and this may well have been what Xi Jinping was trying to signal, that the President of the United States is so besotted and so impressed with the glory of the rejuvenated Chinese nation and the beauty and the majesty of the Forbidden City, so taken by the tractor pull of the huge Chinese market. The chemistry between the two leaders is such that the United States is going to prioritize the U.S.-China relationship at the expense of controversial issues like human rights, like the South China Sea, etc., then the implication for the countries in the region is that the era of Pax Americana has ended, and that the new era with Chinese characteristics, the China dream, may be beginning. And if that's the case, we need to hedge. We need to move closer. We need to get on board, so to speak. And that has tremendous and negative ramifications for U.S. security interests and for our broader agenda.
And trade. I mean, pulling out of
Yeah,
TPP sort of seeds a lot of.
But if there's any place where there's going to be tension down the line, it's going to be on trade. I mean, this is an incontrovertible fact. The playing field is out of level, and there are a lot of very, insoluble contradictions that have to be confronted.
So today in his remarks, Trump said, emphasized over and over again this idea of fair and reciprocal trade, and then touted this $250 billion or $9 billion or $1 trillion trade deal, the set of trade deals that he made in China. Maybe Danny or Bonnie, if you'd like to, just explain to us what might be contained in those $250 billion, and how meaningful was that?
Well, first, I agree with what Orville said earlier. Some of these contracts are likely to be signed anyway. The Chinese buy a certain number of Boeing aircraft. They need new aircraft. They've got a lot of people flying, more and more every day. They buy a lot of American soybeans, corn. There was discussion about a natural gas deal. I don't think in the end of the day that has been finalized. But, some of these things may be solid contracts. Others may really be MOUs that we don't really see realized. But the interesting thing is that we go back to the campaign where the main message of Donald Trump to the American people regarding China was that China was an unfair trading partner. It had taken advantage of the United States. It had stolen American jobs. It was a currency manipulator. And of course, day one of his presidency, he was going to declare China currency manipulator. And many people, including the president, have continued to talk about what they refer to as China's predatory trade practices. And there are people in the White House who are doing work investigating the ways in which China is pursuing its economic interests at the expense of the United States. We saw, for example, Secretary of State Tillerson, when he spoke at CSIS about a month ago before the president went to Asia, talking about, for the first time ever, the need to counter China's Belt and Road strategy. And people talk about the China 2025 manufacturing plan. China's trying to become the global road innovator. 2025 plan is essentially to make China the global leader in innovation. The Belt and Road strategy is a knitting of projects around China's periphery that focus really pretty much on infrastructure, where China's providing mostly loans to countries, but the success of these will vary from country to country, and I think project to project. But it is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy strategy, and the United States has not really been a player in terms of providing infrastructure in the region. And the Japanese and India, now the United States, are talking about working in ways that we might provide alternatives. So my point just being that it seems that this set of agenda items have taken a backseat to some extent to North Korea, although the president still talked about them in China, including in his press availability with Xi Jinping. But I believe we are going to see trade actions. We are going to see something on intellectual property, which is the Special 301 investigation that is ongoing. And we might see something on steel overcapacity. So, I mean, the real question is, if the administration does that, what do the Chinese do? They are likely to retaliate. Is this a one-time tit-for-tat, or do we see an escalating trade war? And I think that's something to watch in the future going forward.
And would it throw off North Korean cooperation and things like that? Would it sort of have spillover effect?
I tend to think that whatever China does on North Korea, it does because it serves its own interest. It doesn't do favors really for the United States.
I mean, this is one of the enduring questions of our China policy, right, which is how much tension and friction you can inject into one piece of the relationship and the degree to which that will then spill over into other areas.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the theory that guided the Obama administration was the conviction that there were going to be areas of cooperation and areas of competition inevitably in the relationship, and that we had to deal with them in their own right and not trade off values and priorities as barter for tactical advantage on a given problem. I couldn't agree more with Bonnie that I think it is really a fallacy to think that China is taking action vis-a-vis North Korea as a favor to the United States. There are huge Chinese equities here, and they're pursuing them. On the issue of the trade deals, whether it's $9 billion or $250 billion or $1 trillion or a gazillion, look, I think every president tries to scratch that itch. I think Obama, George Bush, Clinton, everybody wanted to have a nice big package of business deals connected with an overseas trip. I think there was a higher degree of scrupulousness on the number side. Can't imagine, certainly in the Obama administration, not being grilled down to the $1,000 level on how real are these deals, et cetera. The thing to remember is, number one, governments don't make business deals. Companies make business deals. Two, after the washing's done,
On our side.
Chinese government
on the other side.
there's a huge discount factor in terms of the realization rate, but that's always going to be the case. And I'm sure there are some big deals in there. This is a big economic relationship. But no transactional deal making goes to the structural problems that need to be addressed in the U.S.-China economic relationship and that President Trump and the Trump administration have prioritized. So when I said at the outset that the question you have to ask looking at a visit is what were the real outcomes and what was left on the table, what were the opportunity costs, this is what I mean. A trip that is planned to create outcomes that will either during the visit or in the aftermath of the visit begin to address the prejudicial treatment of U.S. companies in China, the fundamentally unfair issues of market access, et cetera, the suborning and the appropriation of intellectual property and source codes and so on. That is worth working for. That's worth using the tremendous leverage of this glorious visit and pomp and circumstance, the state visit with Chinese characteristics. But Mar-a-Lago was very much about personal relationship and creating a mood. Now the Beijing summit similarly was really about feelings and not about outcomes. So if in fact, as Bonnie suspects, the administration, having had this wonderful love fest in Beijing, turns to the trade agenda and puts on its brass knuckles and takes a swing at China, I think that it's a given that there will be painful retaliation and that it will do considerable damage to the bilateral relationship.
Romance notwithstanding.
I mean, look
Romance
what happened
notwithstanding.
to South Korea when they brought in the THAAD missile defense system. I mean, they got punished. I think you're absolutely right, Danny, that if you look at the trip, I mean, really what we saw most of was the sort of theater of it. The deliverables, besides the $250 billion, there really wasn't anything very tangible. There were things discussed, and that was supposed to sort of satiate people's desire for a sense of some conclusion, some outcome. But actually, there was very little.
I mean, I have to say, in fairness, it is really hard to get the Chinese to do the things that we think they ought to do and that they don't. It is not easy. So it's not as if there was a shortcut that could have been taken. I don't think there are shortcuts in the U.S.-China relationship.
No, but it's important to remember this fact because the president is very much talking about this in terms of being a big success. And I think we have to sort of be mindful that there is a column where the concrete issues have to be there to have a really big success. I mean, it wasn't a failure, but it was. I think the successful part was more in the theater of it.
Well, lowering expectations is, of course, the great.
The best
secret
you can say is it's a work in progress.
Well, wasn't it always?
But there was also, I mean, the day 3 of the administration when we pulled out of TPP, the idea that 8 countries in Asia were going to line up to have bilateral trade agreements with us, and that seems to have very much not happened during this trip.
And now TPP is marching off without us.
Yeah. So that's a kind of, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but I mean, how long do you think the United States can sort of be on the sidelines or absent from multilateral trade in the region? I mean, when we cede that ground, is that irreversible, or if this goes on for another 3 years or more, or are there ways that the concerns that other countries in the region have about China would allow us to kind of quickly recover that lost ground if we had an administration that wanted to
my hope
recover it?
Is that if TPP goes forward, the economists tell us who crunch the numbers that the United States will suffer. I don't remember exactly what the percentage is, but as these agreements are implemented to lower tariffs, I mean, we may, at the end of the day, we would, of course, benefit from some of the higher environmental standards, labor standards, but where it comes to the opportunities for increased trade, that the United States would not benefit. And so my hope is that at some future date there is a recognition of that, whether it be in this administration or the next one, that we need to join this pact. And I assume that it would be open. Maybe that's not a correct assumption, but I think that countries in the TPP 11 would like to see the United States come back. So maybe that's too optimistic. But I think that is one possible scenario.
Any closing thoughts before I open it to the audience?
Well, I would just say about the trip, it actually, I mean, you saw both sides of Donald Trump. You saw the side that could act like the kind of president we are used to having when he goes abroad. And then we also saw the kind of president by the time he got to the Philippines, which was quite different. But I think, the good part of the trip was he did reaffirm the alliances. That's a critical part of our whole position in Asia, The trade thing is his baby. This is his big issue, and what he's going to do about it is still very unclear. And we know we're out of TPP. So is he going to succeed in negotiating 11, whatever the number is, bilateral trade agreements? And what's he going to do about China? That playing field is just as unlevel today as it was when he went out there.
All right, I think we can begin to open it up for questions. But before we start, here's Federico. Federico Rampini from La Repubblica was also on the trip with Orville and Donald Trump, and we thought if you wanted to give any of your impressions of the trip, we'd let you have the first word.
I don't want to disappoint you, but my impressions were by and large the same as those that were conveyed by Orville. So maybe I would rather start with a question. I was trying to imagine, while I was covering this trip, especially in Beijing, together with Orville, sometimes I happened to ask myself, what would a Hillary Clinton trip at this very moment look like? Because I remember that in the end, she announced that she would walk out of the TPP, that the rhetoric of the Democrats during the campaign on trade was somehow similar. At least there was the same urgency to rebalance the relation to China. So I was wondering really, what would Hillary Clinton have done differently on those issues? You mentioned, I found very interesting what you said, Bonnie, about your expectation that there will be action from this administration on trade. You mentioned intellectual property, and you mentioned steel. And you, Daniel Russell, you also talked about all the structural issues. How much should the WTO rules be reviewed, changed, renegotiated? How many of the unfair practices by the Chinese are in fact legal under WTO rules? Because when China entered the WTO, it was a poor country, it was an emerging country, and they needed a special kind of treatment, some kind of privileges. So this exercise might be interesting. What I was constantly wondering, what would Hillary do here? Thank you.
WWHD.
Interesting question. All right, I'll just make a few comments. I think if Hillary Clinton had been president and was going to China, she would have had a large agenda. She would have been talking about not just trade, economics, and North Korea. She would certainly be talking about South China Sea. I think there would have been a human rights element, the impact of NGO law. There would have been discussion of cybersecurity. So I think it would have been a very broad agenda. I don't think it would have been easy for her administration to make a 180-degree turn on TPP very quickly. I think by the perhaps maybe mid point of a 4-year term, that maybe she would have been able to come up with ways in which maybe the United States could have returned to the TPP, but that's a question we'll never know the answer to. I think that there are many people who would have worked inside a Clinton administration who would have wanted to return to the TPP, whereas, of course, you now have an administration that, even though Trump's position was not that dissimilar, you have all these people in the administration who are against it, with very, very few exceptions. So I don't see any discussion at all. The president is adamant that they will not do that. And I think you would have seen a more conventional trip. I think that Hillary Clinton would have, for example, demanded or tried to demand that there be more of a public, maybe speech or questions at the press conference, less on the ceremony side, more on the amount of time that she would spend. I mean, let's remember when President Obama met at Sunnylands with Xi Jinping, the number of hours that they spent talking about the world, their interest, their domestic agendas, and then getting into some of the nitty-gritty stuff. So I think that as President, Hillary Clinton would have wanted to talk about all of those things. So I just think it would have been more conventional and far less emphasis on the pomp and ceremony. I think there also would have been stress on women and children, because that was something that was very important to her.
I think the question of
What would have been similar?
Well, if I can just say, I think one of the big things that would be in the background for Hillary Clinton, first of all, the Chinese were not very well disposed to her. But I think one of the reasons is that she is a representative in ways that President Trump is not of America as a democratic country. And I think that would have, as Bonnie suggested, would have been very much a part of the discussion. And it would have kept them at a certain distance, and they wouldn't have had the same kind of a buddy relationship that I think, to some degree, Trump certainly did affect with Xi. At least he thinks he did. And at least he manifested it as theater.
Maybe we can now take some questions from the audience. Oh, yay, so many. Right here, Ambassador Lord.
Terrific panel. Let me ask the macro question. As a result of this trip, have we shored up our position in Asia under this administration, or are we leaving the field to China? I could elaborate, but I think you know all the subtext of what I'm talking about.
Go ahead, Danny.
All right. It's great to see you, Winston. That's a tough question. And I don't know that the answer is immediately available. But I do think that there's a strong case to be made that the flashbang of the what I'd call diplotainment, the sort of exciting trip, the gold vases and the cheering crowds, masks a strategic uncertainty in the region about the dependability of the United States over the long term. The countries in the region, as you know as well as anybody, don't want to see the emergence of a Cold War between the United States and China, but they definitely want the Seventh Fleet to continue to operate in all the waters of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They want the United States to be stalwart as an ally, as a partner, not just to make nice when visiting Tokyo and Seoul, but also to stand tough when contesting areas of fundamental disagreement with the Chinese, including things like the South China Sea and the treatment of smaller and more vulnerable neighbors. The countries in the region don't want to see a trade war between the United States and China. But they don't want to see economic coercion. They don't want to be reduced to the status of a tributary state. They don't want to be on the receiving end of the kind of punishment that Korea and Lotte was, or that the Philippines was in the Aquino government, or that Japan was over rare earths. They want to have a hedge against Chinese exceptionalism, this notion that the rules apply equally, but some people are more equal than others. And the region doesn't want the United States on a moral Judeo-Christian crusade either. But they do want the United States to stand up for the values that have shaped and informed not only our democratic societies, but the post-war order. The notion that there should be, that freedoms are universal, and they can't be blocked at the border, that sovereignty doesn't extend to free speech, to practice of religion, or for that matter, to the digital world and the digital economy, that people can get rich and can become successful, can educate their children, and can at the same time be able to pursue and express their political views without fear of having it all taken away from them. So the simple point is that the region wants it both ways. They want China to continue to grow, to remain stable, and to be the huge market and the economic driver that it has become, but they also want the United States there as a countervailing force. And to the extent that the courtesies extended to our allies are seen as superficial, and to the extent that the President of the United States is perceived in the region as having come under the thrall of this glorious Chinese hospitality, which, as you know, is a very, very powerful force. But I think perceived as being naive in thinking that the good chemistry and the warm personal relationship that he felt towards Xi Jinping would translate into good behavior. If in fact that is the perception, and there's a lot of troubling polls out there, but they're not definitive. If that is the perception, then I think that it would be the case that the strategic balance could be shifting. But it is not written in stone, and I think that the influence that many of our foreign counterparts and fellow democracies have on the U.S. and specifically on President Trump is a positive factor. And I think also the simple fact remains that while the president and the occupant of the White House will change after an election, their priorities and their style will change, fundamental U.S. national interests are pretty constant. And there are many instances already, I think, where you can see the Trump administration being pulled back towards what is mainstream policy.
Yes, this young woman in the black turtleneck.
Thank you. My name is Asuka Bark. I work for Schiller Institute of Helga LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche. First comment, I really didn't appreciate some of the condescending statements made on our president. But my question is this. I think the $300 billion trade deal that President Trump secured is just a beginning. And I think one of the major achievement of this trip is it created a potential for even larger economic cooperation between U.S. and China in the future. For example, United States joining AIIB or OBOR, the One Belt, One Road policy. And I disagree with some of the idea that One Belt, One Road being another geostrategic policy that can only benefit China. I mean, I hear this a lot, but if you look at some of these credit that has been issued, the loan that has been issued, it's going to Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Greece, Nigeria, Egypt, and these nations are already getting a prospect of having, high-speed rail in their country. And if you look at, recent trade deal that was made between China and West Virginia, I mean, everybody in this room knows West Virginia is the center of opioid epidemic. And China is investing huge amount of they're going to invest more than GDP of that state. That's a great deal, and if we don't welcome this, I think it will show to the world how much cynical we became as a country. So, what do you think about this prospect of the United States joining One Belt, One Road on equal basis?
So I think you may have mischaracterized some of what I said, but I think you made some very good points. Personally, I don't think that the United States as a country should join One Belt, One Road, but I think American companies should have the opportunity. And at CSIS, we have had some meetings with the Chinese and representatives of American companies who are very interested in investing in the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think we need to sign an MOU, and frankly, in order to join, you have to give money, and I don't think our Congress is going to be giving resources to our joining this. But that said, I think it's up to every individual country whether they want to join, but they need to understand the terms of this, and there is a risk of growing debt that will never be repaid, for example. Which I think is not really in the interests of some of these countries. That said, there is an infrastructure need, but there's also many different ways of financing it. As far as investment in West Virginia or anywhere in the United States, I think we should be open to foreign investment. But the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, I think is rightfully it needs to be updated. It is essentially focused on simply the acquisition of companies. It hasn't, for example, included greenfield investments. And at CSIS yesterday, and you can find this online, Senator Cornyn gave a speech because he has written legislation about, I think about 20 bipartisan senators in Congress to update the CFIUS procedures. There are some investments that I think we have to be careful about having the Chinese or any country really invest in. So we have to have our own understanding of how we protect ourselves. But there are a lot of areas. We are the most open country in the world to investment. The problem is that China is closed in so many sectors to investment, and it's not just from the United States. And no matter how many goods the Chinese buy from us, it's not going to solve the problem of them demanding, requiring that a foreign company transfer technology in order to invest in China. This is companies' intellectual property that they are being compelled to transfer. So I'm not a trade lawyer, but that goes back to the question earlier about whether this is consistent with WTO. I mean, there needs to be, I think, a recognition of the fact that China pursues practices that other countries don't. So there is an uneven playing field, in fact. So there's many things about the U.S.-China economic relationship that are very, very positive, and it is an interdependent relationship. The AIIB, just last thing that you mentioned, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. Again, I think countries can join if they want to. I think it was a mistake that the Obama administration, in some cases, twisted the arms of other countries and discouraged them from joining. But whether or not we should join, I mean, that's it. It's something that should be left open to consideration. I don't think it would necessarily be against our interests, but there are other ways that we need to work in the region to promote economic cooperation and provide infrastructure and other advantages to countries to work with us and like-minded countries, frankly, in developing their economies. So some good points, but probably we have some differences on some as well.
Yes, right here.
Hi, thank you all for a really fascinating panel. My name is Eric Hunman. I'm with NYU Shanghai. I wanted to ask what the panel's thoughts were about whether Taiwan got what it hoped to see out of this particular meeting. I had heard from several places that they essentially wanted to stay as low on the agenda as possible in this meeting. And there were some reports of Xi mentioning the issue directly to Trump, but I was wondering how you read those reports, or if you have any other comments on that particular question.
Well, it's inconceivable that President Xi would not raise Taiwan. And I saw a fairly defensive sounding statement in Xinhua insisting that he had said this is the most important issue in U.S.-China relations, et cetera. And there are very conventional set pieces that one typically hears from a Chinese leader in a bilateral summit. I was in Taiwan during actually the 19th Party Congress and in the run-up to the visit by President Trump to China. And yeah, I found them anxious, in part because I think they worried that as a newcomer to office and a newcomer to foreign policy in these issues, that President Trump, who after all you'll remember cast real doubt on central tenet of U.S. policy towards China, towards Taiwan, the one China policy, that he would be insufficiently alert to the implications of something that the Chinese wanted him to agree to, and that he would, perhaps fall into some trap that would undermine their interests. I haven't spoken to any of the representatives of Taiwan since the president was in China, but I assume that they breathed a sigh of relief. President Xi met with James Soong, the representative of Chinese Taipei, to APEC, and that wouldn't have happened if there had been a big problem during President Trump's visit. So I'm assuming that all is as well as it was before the visit, which is not saying a whole lot.
It was interesting in the Great Hall of the People at the so-called press briefing, where there was no questions. There were like 150 members of the press there. The one woman who stood up as they walked out said, "Well, what about Taiwan?" Of course, there was no answer.
All the way at the very back.
Hi, my name is Cole from the Foreign Policy Association. So I'm wondering the relationships between Chinese and U.S. officials beneath Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. In the past, we've seen at the end of the Bush administration and into the Obama administration, the strategic and economic dialogue, I believe it was dialogue. Can you talk about the working relationships that will talk through these structural differences that need to occur in the coming years that work beneath Xi Jinping and Donald Trump? Thank you.
So I would just start by saying that the Trump administration at Mar-a-Lago, when they held the first summit with Xi Jinping, decided to reorganize the dialogues between the United States and China and create 4 new dialogue mechanisms and hold them each separately and not hold them once a year necessarily, which is what the Obama administration had done with the strategic and economic dialogue. But I think probably a lot of the same issues are likely being talked about. The first one was the diplomatic and security dialogue. I think they spent probably about 2/3 of the time on North Korea. So I think it's a bit more narrowly focused than probably those set of issues were under prior administrations. And then there's the comprehensive economic dialogue. And then there's the cybersecurity law enforcement dialogue. And the last one is social, cultural, and people-to-people dialogue, so all of these things really existed, and just in different forms. And they're all headed by different levels of people. The Trump administration likes to say that they're headed by the highest level, but of of course, that's really, in a sense, not true. It varies. In fact, Secretary Tillerson is now head of this people-to-people dialogue, whereas previously it was the vice president. So that one is actually not at as high a level. But I think the real question is whether these mechanisms are making significant headway. And from what I've heard from people in the Trump administration, they were not satisfied with the progress that was made, particularly on North Korea and the trade and economic issues. And I think the hope was that through strengthening the relationship between President Trump and Xi Jinping, that they would make more progress in the future.
Yes. We'll do one more.
Thank you. Robert Delaney from the South China Morning Post. I just wanted to, I had a quick question about the speech that President Trump made this afternoon. He seemed to hit all of the sore points that, with regard to China, in that he talked about an agreement with South Korea or he agreed with South Korea that there should be an expansion of missile defenses. He was adamantly against the freeze for freeze framework. He talked about commitments that he made with Australia and India and Japan in terms of freedom of navigation. Those are the ones I'm thinking of right now. But it seemed like for him to kind of hit all those. Oh, and he also mentioned he seemed to suggest that trade action is coming. He did say trade action against countries that are following unfair trade practices. I'm just wondering your thoughts on why he would hit all those points as strongly as he did at the end of this meeting. Is there a feeling that is this just simply playing to the domestic audience, or does he feel that maybe a lot of the press that he got over the trips, maybe he's pushing back on the idea that he didn't get enough out of the trip? Thank you.
I mean, I think that I got a distinct sense from talking to some people on the trip from the White House that they have an array of things that they are going to roll out, particularly on the trade front. It remains to be seen on what other fronts. And I think you could say, although it will remain to be seen if it's true or not, that they were sort of, Xi Jinping and Trump were trying to have their bromance relationship at the top, and that ultimately there will be whatever kind of praxis at the bottom, which we have to remember there is a very strong tradition in the Trump administration of seeing China, if not as the enemy, at least as a serious challenger that needs to be confronted. I mean, Bannon, Peter Navarro, and there are others. And those people, I mean, that sentiment, I think, is still circulating around someplace. Whether that will actually work out to be the case, it's very hard to say. But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, they really do have to do something, at least about trade.
Anybody want to add anything to that? Okay, we have time for one more. Yes.
Well, Orville, given that Trump either hates or loves people, I would think we'd be happy that he feels he's in a bromance with Xi. And I also think it will give him the confidence, now that he's back and thinking over how much he likes the guy. And also, I just came back, too, from China. The young people that I work with, the young Chinese people on U.S. college admissions, they thought all of that went very well, if they think about it at all. They're not too big into politics. But don't you think that now he feels the confidence because of that relationship, and he wasn't slapped down, that he can start working on the whole trade balance? Because I thought that was the first thing he wants, is balance of trade.
Well, that would be the best scenario, wouldn't it? And that's why I asked my two colleagues what deference is worth. I think he's built up a certain capital account now in the personal relationship account, and it remains to be seen whether he can draw that down and what it's actually worth when it comes to I mean, you two know better than I how these things work. I mean, what's it going to get him? What was this whole trip worth?
I mean, I just don't believe, it may be true in real estate, but I don't believe that in international economics or in national security matters that a reservoir of personal goodwill is going to translate into significant concessions. The traditional logic, and admittedly this is an untraditional administration, that's not always a bad thing, but the traditional approach is to use the runway to try to get lift, to use the preparation in advance of a summit to try to bring the issue close enough to some conclusion that the two leaders, when they sit down, can agree on a formula, on a compromise that at least begins resolving in this case, the underlying structural problems that President Trump has pointed to since he was on the campaign. If the strategy is to establish a warm personal relationship with the head of an authoritarian state, then come back and hit him with tough punitive trade measures in the hope that that personal relationship is going to deter the other leader from retaliating, I think that's a vain hope.
Even in the Obama administration, though, there were efforts to establish rapport, maybe not deference, not a bromance, but rapport between President Obama and Xi Jinping, between Vice President Biden and Xi Jinping before he ascended to power. I mean, there was a theory behind that, right? That
yes.
rapport could serve as some sort of ballast when.
Oh, I mean, what I saw was an effort to establish rapport in the service of communication, in order to ensure a better understanding in both directions. And as Bonnie alluded to at Sunnylands and elsewhere, there were extensive discussions aimed at ushering Xi Jinping into American thinking. Here's why we care about this. Here's what our concerns are. Here is what looks to us like a reasonable compromise. And that is a worthwhile effort. I think, though, that rapport is very different than a charismatic charm offensive, which it may work in some cases. I'm just, I want to see some evidence that the Chinese system is vulnerable to that particular force.
Maybe we have time for one very last. We do not have time for any more questions. We can just thank our excellent panelists for a wonderful job.